Welcome, everyone, to the 16th episode of Thinking Out Loud. We're still trying to figure out how to have the best audio, so apologies for it not being perfect. Today we're joined by Dr. Michael Shermer. He's the founder of the Skeptic Society and editor-in-chief of Skeptic Magazine. He's published many books, including The Moral Arc, Heavens on Earth, and, most recently, Giving the Devil His Due. He's an all-around great guy, and it was nice to have him on. Be sure to check out our previous episode in which we speak with Yasmin Mohammed about Islam and cultural relativism. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 16 of Thinking Out Loud. As always, I'm your host, Vincent Freeman, and I'm joined by my good friend, Bruce. Bruce, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you once again for having us.
And we're joined by a special guest, none other than the skeptic himself, Dr. Michael Shermer. Michael, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Hi, gentlemen. Glad to be here. Nice to see you all in proper social isolation. I see you're at least 6 feet apart.
Yes, that's the plan. How are you holding up during the pandemic?
Oh, everything's okay here. I live in Santa Barbara. There's not many cases up here at all, although I have no idea how well the testing is going. But yep, so far so good. I just work out every day and write a few hours, and life hasn't really changed all that much. I deliver my lectures for my Chapman University course remotely, and I think the students don't actually mind that much. So I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's funny. I live in Santa Barbara for the most part. In fact, that's how I had the pleasure of knowing you. We first met at a Science Salon event in which the keynote speaker was Whitney James, and the topic of conversation was on vaccinations. And that was an interesting conversation because we had some anti-vaxxers joining the fray, and they were very combative towards the end. But it was a fun meeting. You and we managed to have dinner afterwards. It was very fun and pleasurable. And I must thank you once more because you paid for the dinner. So thank you very much for paying. For very generously offering your wallet.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Because Whitney was lecturing instead of me, so we took her out as our guest lecturer, even though Whitney and I are kind of organizing that local salons here. Well, I guess they're no more for a while.
Yeah.
But yeah, she got a taste of a little bit of my world of how people in the margins operate. That is, anti-vaxxers use similar techniques as Holocaust deniers and creationists and other science deniers by acting like, I'm just asking a few questions here. I'm just curious about this one little thing here. Of course, they're not curious. They know exactly what they're doing. They're planting these seeds of doubt, just like the tobacco industry did in the 50s and 60s. They created a playbook of planting a seed of doubt. The book title that analyzes this is called "A Doubt." I think it's "A Doubt is Our Product." Anyway, that's the famous line from the memo that was leaked from the tobacco industry. We can't combat the science, so all we can do is just say, the jury's not in. What jury? Where? There's no jury. The jury's not in. We need more science. We need a counterbalance fit. We need another perspective. I'm just asking a few questions here. They all do that. So the anti-vaxxers, they do that, and also moving the goalpost. What's called moving the goalpost. That is, they'll make a particular claim, and then the scientists or skeptics will refute that, and they go, oh no, that's not what we're arguing. We're arguing this over here. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay, and then we come back with a rebuttal that, oh no, not that. No, it's this. Like with, it's the mercury in the vaccines. Okay, well they took mercury out of vaccines in the year 2000. Okay, not the mercury. No, it's the intensity of the vaccines. Well, no, they've adjusted. Okay, no, it's the frequency of the vaccines. No, here's why that's wrong. Okay, not the frequency. It's the combination of the vaccines. In other words, they just keep changing it. Mm-hmm. And that tells us it's pseudoscience instead of science because they're not playing by the rules of science, which say that when your argument is refuted, you admit it and you move on to the next topic, to the next area of research. You don't just dwell on that as if we started with this conclusion and we're sticking with that conclusion no matter what anybody says. That is a sign of just pseudoscience or pseudo history. Like David Irving made this argument back in the late 90s about There's no holes on the gas chamber at Krema 2 at Auschwitz-Birkenau. So therefore, there was no Holocaust. And when people heard this, they went, "What the hell is he talking about? No holes, no Holocaust." And that even became like a T-shirt slogan for him in his trial. Well, what he was talking about was that one of the accounts by the SS guards of how the Zyklon B was introduced into the gas chambers at Auschwitz-Birkenau is that they did it through these holes in the ceiling, through these little induction ports where they pour it in. Well, if you go there, there's no holes in the ceiling, it says David Irving. Well, that's because there's no ceiling. The Nazis dynamited the whole thing just before the Russians liberated the camp in January of 1945. So it's just rubble. So I point this out to him. It's like, David, how can you even say this? You're acting like it's an intact concrete ceiling with no holes, but that's not what it is. It's just a pile of rubble. So of course there's no holes. And he's like, yeah, I know. It's like, okay, why do you keep saying that? Because it works. So that's lying. That's called lying. So anyway.
It's so weird. Just when you think you have them backed up into the corner, they manage to find just a little bit more wiggle room to sort of just pestilentially spread themselves around. And now we're having to deal with the sort of, I guess, COVID-19 truthers and the whole 5G tower thing. So I don't think we're ever going to get rid of these conspiracy theorists. And there's some interest. You're probably more well versed in this department than I am, but there's some interesting psychology behind what exactly makes someone a conspiracy theorist, why they choose to adopt conspiracy theories. But anyways, I digress. We're here to talk about.
It's okay. Let's digress for a moment because it's an important subject. I mean, first of all, the 5G thing is actually nothing new. There were conspiracy theories about 4G, 3G, all the way down to the original cell phones in the 90s when those really came on. Well, first smartphones in 2000, and then like the Motorola phone that everybody held to their head in the 90s. There were conspiracy theories about that, all those causing cancer clusters, causing brain tumors, and so on. None of it panned out. So I wasn't surprised to see the 5G rollout in connection with the pandemic that we're going through because they happened at the same time. 5G is just a more powerful system than 4G to handle more devices in one particular area. So they have to put up more towers. And in any case, and what we showed with the cell phone link with brain tumors is that the energy emitted by cell phones, or cell phone towers in this case, is too weak to break the chemical bonds of DNA to cause cells to begin to mutate and turn into cancer cells or turn into COVID-19 disease or whatever. The energy just it can't do that. So there's no connection. Of course, then they moved the goalposts. They go, no, that's not what we're saying. We're saying that people were already getting sick for some other reason, and the authorities are blaming it on this COVID-19, and they're doing that to cover up this other thing. And in other words, the story just keeps changing. And of course, Bill Gates has always been a target, because in conspiracy thinking, a power is very important to conspiracists. That is one of the drivers of conspiracy thinking is who has power and who doesn't, and how can we get it, right? So it's always the losing party after an election that becomes very conspiratorial about what happened during the election. It was rigged and so on. The winning party almost always just stops conspiracizing because we won. So now we have the power. So it's always the people outside, that think corporations are more powerful than they are, and so on. So it was a perfect storm with COVID-19, with 5G, and then of course people like Bill Gates, who's just trying to help. I mean, this guy's been hammered his whole life for being rich, and now he can't give it away fast enough. And he's trying to do these, things to help poor people in Africa and so on, and stop these pandemic diseases. And, and for this, he gets, accused of being, a conspiracist who wants to force vaccinations on everyone in the world, and parenthetically to inject tracking devices such that, like in the book of Revelation, when it says the Antichrist will track everybody in the whole world. So the authorities are going to inject in us, along with the vaccine for COVID-19, a chip device. And so, of course, they glommed onto this contact tracing program where you see who has it and who they come into contact with, which sounds innocuous enough, but to a conspiracist, this is, they're going to trace us, that word tracing. Anyway, it just gets crazy like that.
Yeah, it's absolutely strange, and blows my mind that there's some people even going as far as expecting for Bill Gates to donate almost all of his billions of dollars, so much so to the point where he'd only have just a couple million left and say, there you go, you can live off of that. It's
Well, of course he
certainly
could, but
strange.
the idea behind investments is that the money builds more money. I mean, he's
Hmm.
actually worth more than he was when he retired and set up his foundation. And but Bill's thing is to give it. It's it's like effective altruism. That is, you do it in a rational way in which you allocate the money for the most effective charities or non-governmental organizations that are doing very specific targeted things like deworming children or vitamins in certain countries or potable water, mosquito nets, just things that will directly save lives rather than some root causism thing like we're going to end poverty and that'll do it. It's too big.
Hmm.
Just a very specific targeted thing. And so there's a whole movement called effective altruism that was really started by Peter Singer and his whole idea about the lives you can save. He's the guy that came up with that thought experiment that if you were walking along a path and there was a pond there and somebody was drowning and you had on a pair of $500 boots, nice leather boots, would you go in and ruin the boots and save the person's life? Of course, most people say, well, yeah, of course I would, because I value human life more than $500 my pair of my boots. He goes, well, okay, you're doing that now, by buying the boots and not donating to some effective charitable organization. With $500, you could save how many lives, whatever, with mosquito nets or potable water, vitamins, whatever, vaccinations in some poor African country. So you should do that. Anyway, that movement I think is pretty effective now at getting people to just think about. I shouldn't just throw my money at some charity that sounds good, the Red Cross or whatever, because we all want to help, but to very specific things like your money is going to go to this one thing right there. Like years ago, I adopted a child in Romania, and they got me because they showed me a picture of her. Here she is. She's 8 years old. Here's her house. She likes to play soccer. Here's her brothers and sisters. And your $30 a month is going to do this and this and this for her. So by showing me a picture, it's like, oh, so she's like somebody I know, like an honorary friend, as opposed to like showing me a picture of 10,000 starving children in Africa or something. Like, that's just hopeless. What am I going to do? I'm just one person. Right. So that's part of that effective altruism. And I think Gates he's a good guy on that.
Yeah,
And going
absolutely. Yeah. Oh,
going with the
go ahead.
idea of effective altruism, like I read some of Peter Singer's material. It's also about like what going for the biggest bang for the buck.
Hmm.
Is looking to explore.
Yeah. So again, with investments, well, the money works for you. I mean, if you just have let's say a hedge fund or a fund tied to the S&P 500 or the Nasdaq or the Dow, except for the recent downturn. I mean, it has a good return of like 10% a year. So you're doubling your endowment, every few years at that rate, like every I don't know, what is it, 5 to 10 years or something like that. And so you can continue doing more charitable works by investing the money and giving it away in a very systematic fashion, as opposed to just saying, well, Gates is worth $100 billion. He should give 99 billion of it away today. Well, that's actually not the smartest thing to do. The most rational thing to do is keep investing it and making money, and then keep the endowment growing and keep investing in charities in perpetuity. This is how these accounts work. I think people don't always realize this, like the Nobel Prize account or the MacArthur Genius Award Foundation. Those are all based, the Templeton Prize. These are all based on rich people investing properly in a way that the endowment continues to grow forever, and therefore they
Hmm.
can continue to fund charities forever in perpetuity, unless the entire economy collapses or something like that. So that's actually that's kind of a rational way of being altruistic.
Hmm. Yeah, I'd always say that if Bill Gates even just does 1% of the things that he claims he's going to do, he would have already have done more for humanity than 99.99% of the population on the planet. And what's great is that these are topics that you talk about quite a bit and you're very well versed in them. And as we mentioned in your book, and specifically in the section that you have on politics and society, these are topics that you go into the ideas behind libertarianism versus classical liberalism, why it is that you chose to deviate from libertarianism towards more classical liberalism. And I just want to say it's a fantastic book. I have it right here. And I'm very happy that you're one of the few people out there that actually puts thought into the covers. I think having a nice cover is one of the best things about book authoring. And your previous book, Heavens on Earth, I think has one of the best book covers on the planet there.
Oh, thank you.
So yeah, I have it right here somewhere. Um, Here you are. Yeah, so this is another
Oh yeah, there it
fantastic
is.
book cover.
Yes. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah, I was very happy
fantastic.
with that. Yeah, I agree. I'm glad you said that because I'm a big fan of books, as you can see behind me. This is just a
Yeah.
tiny fraction of the number of books I have. I love physical books. You know, I'm an okay boomer, I guess you might
Yeah.
say. And I still read physical newspapers, and I love getting a physical book in the mail and picking it up and flipping through it. And I do a lot of audiobooks. That's great. I know people that do ebooks. That's fine. It's all good. All different platforms is wonderful, but physical books still matter. The quality of the paper, the printing, the typography, layout, to me, the font that's chosen, the cover design, all that matters. I think that's, it's an art form.
100% agree. And perhaps you can try to get me to convince Bruce over here to stop buying books on his Kindle and finally start buying some physical copies.
Well,
Well,
they're easier to lug around for me. But Dr. Shermer, your book, The Moral Arc, was one of the more one of the books I've read that made the deepest impressions on me because it altered my worldview to the point where like I have some cautious optimism that we can potentially head towards a future that's more or less akin to what Gene Roddenberry intended. And I still hold out even today. We still might reach that. We actually discussed the book several years ago. I actually met you at an event with the San Diego Skeptic Society, which my friend Jamie Ian Swiss put on a few years
right.
back, and the topic was the material in the moral arc.
Yeah, that's interesting. I remember that. Yeah, Jamie's a great guy. One of the things I like about Jamie and all magicians that are skeptics is they're really skilled in understanding the human psychology of deception and illusion and how we make mistakes in our thinking. Because of course that's what they do for a living is fooling people. So in a way, magicians have been ahead of cognitive psychologists who study that, by many decades. So I'm glad to see people like him, kind of merge into that. Yeah. So the moral arc, I think the arc has continued to bend. I mean, since I wrote that book, the Supreme Court voted on same-sex marriage, and that's now the law of the land. And you almost never hear that even in conversation anymore. Like, what is your position on gay marriage? Or, I mean, people don't really even ask anymore because it's kind of a settled moral issue we just take for granted now. And that's how it works. It's like that's why no one ever talks about interracial marriage anymore. If you ask people, yeah, you remember when that was a big controversy? People go, what? Yeah, until 1967, it was illegal in the United States for blacks and whites to marry. And that was on the books going back centuries. And finally the Supreme Court decided in the Loving case in 1967 that that was now the law of the land,
Mhm.
and so on. So that just kind of happens over just slow enough you barely see it. It doesn't really appear in the daily news. It's a kind of slow trend, slow burn trend that unfolds over years or decades. So you don't see it unless you track it with data sets, which I do. So and there you can see why a comment like conservatives today are more socially liberal than liberals were in the 1950s. People go, what? Wait a minute. Oh, yeah, that kind of makes sense. That we've all had our consciousness expanded, as Richard Dawkins likes to talk about it, or the arc of the moral universe is bent toward justice, as Dr. King said. The moral sphere is expanding, as Peter Singer talks about. Whatever metaphor you want to use, things are getting better for more people in more places, which is not to say that they're perfect or, that we don't have room to grow or that there aren't issues still needed to be dealt with. But the fact that, a good thing happened and then a bad thing happened and then a good thing happened is not to say it's all just random and good and bad things happen. You have to track the long-term trends to see where it's going.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
hopefully
the
we can
moral zeitgeist continues to progress. Sorry, Bruce, you were saying.
I'm hoping we can definitely dig into some of that today. It's part of the reason we have this podcast is we want to explore thoughts along those lines and see like putting the information out there so people realize that that the arc is expanding, that there is a progression in quality of life, and despite the doom and gloom headlines, we are making progress. But Vince, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and some of the questions that I sort of plan on giving you, um, they're not questions that I necessarily agree with. They're more or less just questions to sort of give the devil his due, to
Okay.
as the subtitle
Yeah,
of your
yeah,
book.
yeah. Let's
Um,
do that.
yeah, so one of the first things that I wanted to ask you is that the first section of your book, it's sectioned into 5 parts, and the first section is on free thought and free speech. And one of the foundations of your book is on the capacity to reason, to be able to deliberate questions, ponder questions, and hopefully get to the correct answer. Now, I wanted to ask you, how confident are you in our species' ability to reason? Are you confident enough that we can cooperate to the point where we deal with existential threats such as climate change, the proliferation of nuclear weapons, even AI, superbugs? I know people like Pinker and Harris are pretty confident, but given all of our biases, are you genuinely confident in our ability to reason enough for free speech to be absolute?
Pretty confident, yes. I'd say Steve Pinker and I are pretty much along the same track there. In cognitive psychology studies of biases, heuristics, and ways that thinking goes wrong, if you pile up the list, it looks pretty bad. It looks like we are just so error prone. It's helpless and hopeless. And of course, when you cite the research of people like Tversky and Kahneman, you read Danny's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and so on, and the pop versions of this by Malcolm Gladwell. Yeah, it looks like that we make a lot of errors, but I would also counter with Gert Gingeringer's books and now Hugo Mercier's research that shows we're actually not that bad at reasoning when you put the problems in a way that are more natural for humans to solve. That is to say, you take something like the famous Wasson test, where you have 4 cards, um, and two of them are flipped up so you could see whether it's a letter or a number, and then the subjects are given a rule and they have to kind of reason through the logic of which cards to flip over to see if the rule is true. I forget what it is. Like if it's a D, then it has to be an even number on the other side. Which card do you flip over to test this? Whatever. People do really bad at questions like that involve sort of symbolic logical reasoning. Along the lines of, if you take a class in the philosophy of logic, you're presented with these logical problems that are really brain teasers. But evolutionary psychologists like Tooby and Cosmides up here at UC Santa Barbara, they showed if you restructure the questions in the form of like a social relationship thing, a problem, human social problem, like you're a bouncer at a bar, and you have and the people there have to be 21 or over if they're drinking alcohol. So you have somebody who's drinking alcohol, someone who's drinking Coke, someone who's underage, someone who's over 21. Okay, which of these do you test to see if the rule is being applied that if you're over 21 you can drink alcohol, if you're under you can't drink alcohol? Subjects do much better at solving that problem, even though it's the exact same problem as the Wasson test. So if you present problems as what's called our ecological niche, ecological cognitive niche, a natural environment which we evolved to reason about other people, then we do much better. So I just had Hugo Mercier on my podcast. He has a new book out called Not Born Yesterday. So he shows new research indicates that we're not that dumb, we're not that irrational. That, for example, political advertisements and also things like the Russian hacking of the 2016 election of sort of dropping into Twitter feed and Facebook feed these crazy stories about like Hillary and the pedophile ring at the pizzeria. Hugo shows that if you are already inclined to believe something like that, you probably hate Hillary so much, you're never going to vote for her. So my pointing out to you that your conspiracy theory about the pizzeria pedophile ring is wrong is irrelevant, because they don't. That's not why they're not voting for Hillary. Okay. So the thinking is that people have made up their minds about, say, political candidates for other reasons that don't have to do with these specific arguments. And that the idea that, we need to counter the fake news or, the Russian bots or something, it's probably not that much to worry about. People are not that stupid and malleable to fall for these sorts of things. And so in general, I'm moving more and more in that direction, even though I've spent my whole career, sort of debunking irrational thinking on so many subjects. In a way, most people, I think, can be reasoned out of bad beliefs, if they're not committed to a belief for some other reason, right? So if somebody says, look, I'm a Christian and I accept Jesus as my savior and I don't know anything about evolution, what's the story here? Well, I can tell them in a way that they can keep their religion. If I tell them you have to be an atheist, you have to give up this crazy Jesus, zombie Jesus stuff, okay? They're going to be insulted, offended. They're not going to be listening to anything I say about the theory of evolution. So if you present it in a way that's non-threatening to their worldview, then they're more likely to accept the evidence, and people can reason when in those conditions. So I'm optimistic.
Yeah, that's good. And I should say that I wholeheartedly agree with you on this. I was originally much more pessimistic about the nature of reality, but ever since listening to the works of Steven Pinker and even yourself for the Moral Arc, I'm a lot more optimistic about society, and I think that we can eventually progress. Have you ever heard about the problem of superbugs? I don't know if you're aware of superbugs. Matt McCarthy recently wrote a book about this, about how we have sort of infectious diseases that are becoming on the rise, and they're being able to counteract our strongest antibiotics. And he says, like,
Yeah,
look, there's
yeah,
there's some points where I'll have to prescribe something as powerful as colistin, because people are dealing with just these antibacterial diseases that are so powerful that our
yeah,
strongest antibiotics just don't work. And
yeah,
the
yeah.
CDC has estimated that by the year 2050, 10 million Americans will be infected by these superbugs. So, and given the current pandemic, have you had any shift in consciousness when it comes to our current healthcare system? What we should do about this?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, of course, that superbugs, these are bacteria, not viruses. Bacteria are
Sorry,
much bigger
bacterial.
and they respond to antibiotics. Viruses don't respond to antibiotics. They're 1,000 times smaller than bacteria. Effectively invisible except for electron microscopes. So that's one reason why pandemics are so kind of susceptible to conspiracism, because you can't see them. They operate almost in this like invisible deadly force. Um, so that argument about the superbugs, first of all, it's an example of evolution at work, by the way. Natural selection grinding away, and in a way, we may see something like that with the current COVID-19 pandemic. Is that within say a year from now, I'm predicting it will be far less deadly, in as much as the people who were most susceptible to the deadliest form of it will have died, and those of us that survive, that the milder version to come along, which is what Fauci was saying yesterday, it'll be just like another flu, in really probably indistinguishable from the other coronaviruses, and we're just going to have to live with this probably forever. Which is kind of disconcerting, but that's the reality of it. And the superbug argument is along the same lines, that we've overprescribed these antibacteria to the point where the bugs are mutating and evolving around workarounds. And of course, they do that. You've seen that with the COVID-19. If a viral infection is so deadly that it kills the host before they get out and infect other people, that's not a good strategy for the virus. A better strategy, and now appears to be the case with COVID-19, is that the victim has no symptoms for a few weeks before they get violently ill, and that way, during those few weeks when they're infected but not showing symptoms, they can infect a lot of other people. That's actually a good strategy if you're a virus. and it now looks like that's probably what's happened, because it's probably been in the United States since November, December. Here in California, they were saying just yesterday that they think it was here a month earlier than we thought it was, and the people in Seattle are now saying, because their first case zero was mid-January, that it was probably a month before that at least. So, I think that it's hard to say much more than that, because this is one of these stories that changes really by the hour,
Hmm.
if I go out for a 2 or 3 hour bike ride and I come back, I discover I'm like hopelessly behind the news. It's like, oh no. And so I think once in a while it's okay to just turn off the news and quit following social media just to regain your sanity. But all these things, I would say the superbugs, pandemics like this, should be on the list, top 5 list of things to worry about. Climate change, nuclear weapons, AI maybe, probably not. I'm not too worried about AI. But if you want to put it on the list, that's okay. 5 things. I was at that TED conference in, I think it was 2015 in Vancouver, when Bill Gates gave that speech about, the next big pandemic is going to be a killer. And, he called it. But I remember sitting there thinking, yeah, right. They said that about N1, S1, and SARS and MERS and all these other Ebola. Nothing came of it. So I'm just not. I know he's probably right, but I'm just not going to worry about it. And I think really that's pretty much the attitude everyone has had up until a couple months ago now.
Yeah.
And so I think the finger blame. For various reasons, but not the least of which, it wasn't that long ago, just a few weeks or months ago, that we really didn't know what was going to happen. It wasn't at all clear that we should shut down the entire economy in January or February. Now, if somebody did that, they'd be considered prophetic, but we didn't know that. And, anybody that would do that would be considered dictatorial. It's like, people were worried that that's what Trump was going to do, because Xi in China, and Kim in North Korea, and Oban in Turkey, Hungary, and Erdogan in Turkey, and Putin, and so on. These are like dictators that are using the pandemic as a means of grabbing more power, silencing their censors, accusing people that are skeptical of their policies or whatever, fomenting fear and hate amongst the population. So they should be censored. So people at the time were saying, well, I bet that's what Trump's going to do because he secretly wants to be a dictator. And it's like, yeah, okay, I could see him trying to do something like that. But he didn't do that. And so he's criticized for not doing that. It's like, okay, I don't want to say poor guy because it's hard to like Trump, but but the position of president of any country in the middle of something like this where nobody knows. I mean, Fauci doesn't know. He's not a deity. He's a smart guy. I love Fauci, but he's not God. Okay, he's not omniscient. He doesn't know. No one knows. So, we're in the middle of this, should we do this or that? And that constant tension in civil society between security and freedom, that's always going to be there. We always give up freedoms. I give up the freedom to drive on either side of the road that I want so that I can safely drive on the right side of the road and not worry about it, right? So I give up freedoms all the time. I don't have any problems with that. It's just, so where do you draw the line, right? Mm-hmm. And, now the governor of Georgia wants to open it up, and Trump's going, no, maybe that's not bad. It's like, whoa, okay. A week ago, Trump was, accused of the opposite thing. So, I think, again, the finger pointing thing is not terribly helpful.
Mm-hmm. Doctor, part of your book has to deal with the bedrock value of free speech, and you make the arguments inside there that part of why it's such an important value is that it allows an individual to hear a variety of arguments and helps them sharpen their thought, helps them enhance critical thinking. I wanted to get your thoughts on that term, critical thinking, because that's a term that's occasionally thrown out, but I've never heard a good definition to. When we see occasional conversations between left and right wingers, there's always a lot of accusations thrown around about how their counterparts don't think critically, but I've never heard any of them be able to pinpoint exactly why their accusations are valid. I have trouble defining it myself.
Yeah.
I took a stab at it on my own, and after researching the Enlightenment, I understood there were two schools of thought that clashed. One was rationalism, which seems to be everyone's default mode of thinking, which I describe as reasoning through a set of premises to assert a conclusion, which isn't enough by itself because you can justify just about anything that way. And for me, true critical thinking, for it to occur, rationality has to be hemmed in by empiricism, and the reasoning has to fit within the confines of whatever evidence that is available. Do you have something to add to that? Would you like?
I think you said it perfectly. That's a perfect way to say it. Well done, Bruce. Thanks. I may use that. I mean, really, a balance between rationality and empiricism, or reason and empiricism. Yes, you can reason your way down the rabbit hole to some crazy conclusion because one of your premises early on was simply wrong, and that happens all the time. Which is why, at some point, you got to look out the window and see if the real world is actually like the premise you're assuming is true. And so I would say that's true for all claims. And so much of progress that we've made over the last several centuries is due to the combination of that. Before the Enlightenment, before the scientific revolution, let's say, the idea of empirically checking your sources, your premises, running experiments, observing, that was kind of the new thing that people were not comfortable with. And that, that kind of armchair theorizing was what scholastics did. Professional philosophers, that's what they did. They ran these thought experiments in their head, which is fine. That's, Einstein did famous thought experiments, but Einstein's not famous for his thought experiments. He's famous because the empirical tests of the thought experiments turned out to show he was right. Well, of course, he had mathematics too. So, and we can assume that mathematics is definitely linked to reality. So, the idea that scientists are uncovering something that really exists, I think, has to be in our set of assumptions. So the course I teach at Chapman, Skepticism 101, How to Think Like a Scientist, I don't use the phrase critical thinking because it's so overused, and like people go, what's that? Or it sounds like it's a boring philosophy class in logic or something. No, it's just what we want to know is what's true. What is true about the world? And what is truth anyway? What does that mean? So I start my class there and under the assumption that no one's omniscient. I mean, when we say God only knows, we mean this comes from Christopher Hitchens. When somebody says God only knows, they mean nobody knows. That's what the phrase means. Of course, Hitchens meant it also in the sense that there is no God. But even if you believe there's a God, you're not God. All right. So, and he's not giving us divine wisdom through his words on, how to fight the coronavirus or whatever. So we're left always fumbling around under great uncertainty, trying to determine what we should do based on what we think is true. So all of science is based on, Bruce, what you said. There's this kind of combination of reasoning about premises and their conclusions, induction and deduction and all that. And then testing hypotheses. So this kind of combination is the very basis of the scientific method, whatever that really is, however that's defined. But that's loosely it.
Yeah, and as you said, seems to be a term that people seem to be tired of, as we don't seem to be able to define it. But I wonder if critical thinking, as we know it, is threatened by what is out there today, because. Well, to give you an illustration, there's a statement out there that knowledge is power. I've heard an addendum to that statement that whoever controls the flow of knowledge has true power. And you stated in several of your previous books that humans have a tendency to see patterns where none exist, and that highly intelligent people are capable of finding just these really, really intricate ways of justifying whatever worldviews they have. So rationalism seems to be a bastardization of what people know as critical thinking. That most of us tend to utilize, and Occam's razor and being humble within the range of our knowledge is not something we tend to remind ourselves of. Now, since we're all in a situation in which we're facing dis or misinformation from regressive leftists from them in terms of subject like blank statism, and from the populist right in terms of issues like climate change, how do we chart a way forward in pushing true critical thought, making use of rationalism and empiricism, especially since with the media the way it is, empiricism seems to be a bedrock that's been completely undercut. I'm not even sure we still have it. The conservatives listen only to Fox News, liberals only listen to CNN and NPR, and I'm liberal myself, and I'm very leery about what comes out of CNN, especially when they try to smear Joe Rogan a few weeks back. So if we don't have a source of truth, how can we critically think?
Yeah, boy, you there's a lot in there. I mean, I used to look to CNN as sort of a bedrock of objective reporting, and I don't get that sense at all anymore. I sense they're pushing back against Fox News that obviously is not objective, And same thing with Rachel Maddow. I always used to really like her. I thought she really did her homework. Or team of researchers she had really did their homework. But now it just seems like they're the anti Rush Limbaugh, anti Sean Hannity, and maybe we need that. I don't know, but I think to your point, we have to get away from that kind of polarized thinking because it's not helpful for understanding what's true. And back to what I was saying before, if you kind of approach people from that perspective, like I'm trying to talk you out of your deepest, most cherished positions you have as you define yourself, by your religion or your political party or your economic ideology or whatever. If you start there, it's a lost cause because most of us don't want to give those up, particularly if you're pretty well set, say by your late 20s, 30s, whatever. You have to come at it around the side, as I like to think of it. That is the analogy I use. If you give people a choice between Darwin and Jesus, a Christian, they're taking Jesus every time. They're not picking Darwin, right? Because there's something else with believing in Jesus that has nothing to do with empiricism or tests or science or reason. It's just their faith tradition. Now, that said, nobody today would say, I don't believe in critical thinking. I don't believe in facts. I don't believe in reason. I don't believe in science. I just believe in, that the truth is whatever I feel like it is. Almost no one says that. Almost everybody thinks that they're being reasonable, that they're rational, that they're the ones that are sticking to the facts. I mean, you tune on Sean Hannity on any given night, and he's always ranting about, I'm the one that gives you the facts and the truth and nothing but the truth. And then the next night, he contradicts himself. Anyway, it's like, no, dude, you're not. But, what does that even mean? And the left can be just as bad. Okay, so, both sides are guilty of some of that. But nobody thinks that they are. Analogously, I like to say no one's in the history of the world has ever joined a cult. People join a group that they think is a really good group. Like, this is a great cause. I want to help the poor, man the soup kitchens. And like, this is Jim Jones in the 1970s. You can Google Jim Jones and comma Jerry Brown, the former governor of California. He was governor of California back in the 70s when Jim Jones was coming of age. And he had a huge popular church in the San Francisco, the Bay Area. And they were integrated. They were like one of the only white churches that was integrated, that had a racial mix. I mean, that was pretty progressive. And Jones's message was, as Christians, we should be helping the poor. And it's like that's a controversial idea. That's a good thing, right? So people that joined Jim Jones in the 70s, they weren't thinking we're going to go to Guyana and drink the Kool-Aid. Of course not. So everybody thinks that they're rational. No one in the history of the world has ever thought of themselves as a pseudoscientist, going down to their pseudo labs to run pseudo experiments and gather pseudo facts and test their pseudo theories, right? They think that they're on to something that's real. So you have to look at what they're actually doing to see if it's really science or not. And that's this is called the demarcation problem. Where do you demarcate or draw the line between science and pseudoscience? Not always that easy to do, like art and pornography or whatever. I kind of know it when I see it, but it's hard to pinpoint. Depends on the particular claim. But to your point, it's one thing to address people on the facts, but you got to make sure you do it in a way that doesn't threaten them. It's not threatening. So to a climate skeptic, denier, whatever, I know that this is highly predicted based on their political position. So I know very likely they're thinking this climate thing is some vast left-wing liberal conspiracy to end capitalism and control the economy and so on. So I have to maneuver around that belief system and say, I'm pro-free markets. I'm a pro-capitalist guy. I love business and industry and trade. It's all great. But climate change is real. And they're like, oh, okay. So I've just taken away from them that idea that anybody that thinks climate change is real has to be anti-business, anti-capitalism, anti-America, whatever. Mm-hmm. So by taking that away, then it sort of forces them to focus on the facts at hand rather than having a battle about worldviews.
This is an interesting segue into the topics of politics now that we're here. So you had an interesting article in the book, and I won't give away what the general synopsis of the article is, but in your article, Healing the Bonds of Affection, You argue for classical liberalism and place an emphasis on the individual rather than on any collective group. Do you think that this is the best perception of humanity to be able to transcend racism? There are like advocacy groups out there, like people like Robin DiAngelo, who say that it's impossible to ignore the collective group because it's specific collective groups that have been discriminated against and identities have been formed around this discrimination. And it's only by acknowledging that reality, the reality that particular groups have gone through, and that we can fully understand the gravity of racism. How would you transcend this sort of tribalistic thought where people say that tribalism or this level of tribalism, this level of identity politics is good?
Yeah. The problem with identity politics is it's taking us back to defining people or judging people based on their membership in a collective, in a group, which is what the civil rights movement initially was against. You shouldn't like treat us because in a certain way because we all have the same skin color or we're all this gender or that religion or ethnic whatever. That was the whole point of the civil rights movement is stop doing that. This is not because races don't vote. Individuals vote. Races are not discriminated against. Individual members of a race are discriminated against. The problem is it's thinking of people as a member of a group and that they're defined by that membership. That's the problem. And so what identity politics is doing is they're doing the exact same thing. They're making the problem worse, not better. And I've several criticisms of my books in the last few years have been, well, he's a middle-aged white guy. What do you expect? It's like, first of all, it's not an argument. Second of all, that's racism and ageism and misogyny or whatever. It's bigotry. And third, you're making it worse. Stop doing that, right? So near as I can figure, I used to call myself a libertarian. I've kind of stopped that now because the word, labels matter, and people carry in their head baggage that goes with labels, all labels, feminism, Marxism, objectivism, libertarian, whatever. People have in their heads, and so I've lately tried classical liberalism on, inspired in part by Dave Rubin because I like how he's presented in a very positive way. But of course, it's an old philosophy. This is the founding fathers. This is Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, and Adams and Franklin and all these John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, all the utilitarians. That they were in a way classical liberals. I mean, John Stuart Mill wrote the defining book on this in 1859, same year as Darwin's Origin of Species, 1859. His book is On Liberty. And so he is the one who makes particularly strong argument about the sanctity of the individual is what matters. And that, that it doesn't matter what groups you belong to. That's irrelevant. So I'm just in a way calling for kind of a return to the old-fashioned way of thinking about people. It's not conservative because conservatives emphasize faith and family and flag. Well, what is that? That's basically tribalism, authoritarianism, this kind of hierarchical social structure with a flag and the nation on top, or you're a member of a nation. So what I'm proposing, classical liberalism, that's not conservatism. And it's not leftism, let's say, or sort of the new version of liberalism. See, liberals back before the 20th century, they were what I'm talking about here. That liberals were like classical liberals, and conservatives were kind of Burkean conservatives. So Edmund Burke wrote the definitive book on this in the 1880s about the French Revolution. I guess it was 1890. 1790, sorry, about the French Revolution, and that he endorsed the American Revolution, was critical of the French Revolution, because in the American Revolution, the Founding Fathers recognized that a lot of tried and true social institutions should be conserved because they work, and let's get rid of the ones that don't work and start anew. The French Revolution, they said, let's get rid of everything that's ever happened, that anyone ever invented, and start completely new. And so Burke was against that. And that's what conservatives argue, is that we need to conserve the social institutions that have worked. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's not true. We don't want to conserve the institution of slavery and torture, for example, or even capital punishment. I think those, they've lost those arguments. But So with classical liberalism, I'm saying let's go back to the founding fathers, whatever you want to call them. I don't care. These are just words we're using. The idea behind the label is the individual is the moral agent, and therefore the target of our moral consideration, and that's where we begin. And stop judging people based on their skin color. It seems to be okay when you say, well, it's an old, middle-aged white guy who's straight, whatever. But if I said, it's a young black person, I'd be strung up. Okay, so how about we just stop doing it entirely, while recognizing that there are still bigots and racists out there, of course, but there's a lot fewer of them than there used to be. And by not acknowledging that, I make this point in the moral arc. In a way, you're just saying the efforts of Dr. King and all the great civil rights activists in the 1950s and 60s, they did nothing. They were completely a waste of time, all their efforts.
Right.
It's like, well, no, they're our heroes. Yeah, why are they heroes? Because they actually did something. We've made progress. And the other, Pinker makes his point that by not acknowledging progress, you're also leading people to feel complacent. Like, why should I bother? Look, people have been trying to make progress for half a century, and they've made no progress. Ferguson and stand your ground. No, sorry, the opposite of stand your stand your ground, and the shooting of Trayvon Martin, and all these other incidences that we see pop up on the news periodically. Those are bad, yes, but to say that, look, things are as bad as they've ever been is in a way to say, why bother? There's no point, because it's never going to get better, and that's the danger of it.
Well, this is an excellent segue into my next question. One of the reasons that I myself, as a liberal, and very, very adamantly against the idea of the toxic identity politics and that we're dealing with today is that more often than not, they seem to provide a very, very convenient shield for us to criticize far right ideas like misogyny or gay rights that are hidden under a minority mask. Like we see that when discussing issues with Islam today. And I've often made the argument to people in my own circle that in a rapidly shrinking 21st century world, moral relativism is no longer a tenable idea. We have to settle on some kind of bedrock for moral principles to move forward if we want the ideas of the Enlightenment to thrive. And with that, I want to explore the idea of morality with you. I think in the moral arc, you've talked about David Hume's is-ought scenario, that's known in philosophy as the naturalistic fallacy. He also stated in his works that he also believes that custom, and I'm quoting him here, renders our experience useful to us and makes us expect for the future a similar train of events with those that have appeared in the past. Two people on the internet, Alex O'Connor and Stephen Woodford, have been discussing whether or not morality can be objective. In one of their podcasts, they came up with the idea that we can't reach a conclusion without the ought statements being included in the premises. But if we include the idea of custom, and if we ask just about anybody, a lot of people acknowledge that life is preferable to death, flourishing is preferable to pain, and we could probably get most people to accept that that is a basis point for an objective starting point for morality, or at the very least, a rational basis for it. But I think I've heard you mention before, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, that you thought the naturalistic fallacy itself is itself a fallacy. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So here's the chapter that I in the book. So it's subtitled, Reflections of a Scientific Humanist. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm arguing, as you mentioned, Sam Harris and Steven Pinker. Steve's been a little less clear about challenging the is-ought fallacy. I know he recognizes that as a legitimate philosophical contribution to say you can't go from is to ought. So, my chapter is called Mr. Hume, Tear Down This Wall. And that this wall is separating facts from values, science from morality. Now, so let's pull back and look at a bigger picture of what I'm doing here. So first of all, for thousands of years, religions have had a monopoly on morality and meaning in life. And all the way up to Steve Gould's famous book at the end of the 1990s, The Rock of Ages, where he made his NOMA argument, non-overlapping magisteria, N-O-M-A, NOMA.
Right.
And most scientists said, yep, that's right. He is right. That Hume was right. You can't go from is to odd. And Gould is right that science can't deal with these kind of metaphysical or moral or meaning questions. That's religion's job. And of course, Dawkins famously skewered this by saying, why religion? Why not the plumber? I mean, what does a theologian know that I don't know as a scientist, right? Now, Richard didn't try to, break down that wall, and who am I to challenge David Hume? I mean, he's one of the greatest minds ever anywhere. Okay, so I'm pretty sure I'm not as smart as him. And I have had two professional philosophers who are friends of mine look at my arguments, and they tell me, no, Shermer, technically you have not refuted the naturalistic fallacy. It's probably not refutable, and here's why. So they have all these kind of technical things. But I'm actually not concerned about that. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not trying to, make some great inroads on overturning Hume. Here's what I'm after. I'm after this bigger problem of religion having a monopoly on this, and scientists have to just go away and back to their labs and mind their own business and quit thinking about how science can inform morality, values, how facts can inform values. And the same thing with meaning. Why should we leave it to theologians to tell us what the meaning of life is? Why can't scientists have something to say about that? And so I have a whole section on that about how lives turn out. Is that chapter is that, we know a lot about, and I have another chapter on finding purpose and meaning in life. We know a lot about what gives people meaning and purpose in life. There's social scientists who do nothing but study this. The whole positive psychology movement, the study of happiness, the study of life satisfaction, the study of finding purpose and meaning and spirituality, like Clay Routledge. He studies like existential the way people think about existential questions in life. That's a kind of a scientific informing us that certain things you can do that make your life more meaningful, like meaningful work, a reason to get up out of bed and out of the house in the morning, unless you're socially isolated. Having family, friends, having a loving relationship of any kind, doesn't matter if it's straight or gay, whatever. Just having a close, tight social community, having something to do that takes you out of yourself. You can call it spirituality, whatever. Just something that kind of puts your little life into perspective, that makes you feel an awe and wonder of the cosmos. Carl Sagan was a very spiritual person in this sense. He made us all aware of of our role in the cosmic drama here. That's all part of it. That's scientists telling us this. Okay, so I don't care if it's technically true or not, whether I've overturned the naturalistic fallacy. I just want to say that it isn't just a choice between divine command theory, God said it, therefore it's right or wrong, and relativism, therefore anything goes, Hitler got away with it, there are no true moral values, and so on. So that's why I quote Abraham Lincoln, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. Well, that's not cultural relativism, and neither is that divine command theory. And so then I declare in an unequivocal defense of moral realism, if the Holocaust is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. So I think we can say that certain things are really objectively, absolutely right or wrong, depending on what you mean by those words. And so I kind of build a case to there, and quoting Pinker, who starts with this kind of Platonic idea of mathematics. This is why I think Steve really, he's kind of on board with me without saying I'm overturning Hume's naturalistic fallacy. Here's Steve. On this analogy, read it properly here with some light. On this analogy, we are born with a rudimentary concept of number. But as soon as we build on it with formal mathematical reasoning, the nature of mathematical reality forces us to discover some truths and not others. No one who understands the concept of 2, the concept of 4, and the concept of addition can come to any conclusion but that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Perhaps we are born with a rudimentary moral sense, and as soon as we build on it with moral reasoning, the nature of moral reality forces us to some conclusions but not others. And so from there, I argue that there are certain moral values that, like the survival and flourishing of individual sentient beings is a good place to start, and from that we can build from there. So here's what I argue at the end of that chapter. Sure, future scientists may one day discover that humans do not have an instinct to survive and flourish, that most people do not want freedom, autonomy, and prosperity, that women want to be lorded over by men, that animals enjoy being tortured, killed, and eaten, and then some that large populations of people don't object to being liquidated in gas chambers. But I doubt, okay? So what I'm saying is that we can discover moral truths in our study of human nature. What is it that people want? What is it that people need? Well, this is what scientists study. So why not let scientists have a voice in the conversation along with philosophers and theologians about what's right and wrong? Anyway, that's my point about scientific humanism. I'm trying that term out. It could be Enlightenment humanism. I like that also. It's very uplifting. I'm a little leery of secular humanism as a term because it's become very politicized. It's very associated with the far left and liberalism in the newer sense. And I'd rather have a bigger tent where everybody could be a humanist. Everybody should be a humanist. But by linking it to a particular political position, like if you don't check these 12 boxes, you're not a secular humanist. How about if I check 10 of the boxes? Okay. So anyway, that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's good. And staying on the topic of morality, I've been thinking about writing an article for Ariel magazine. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but this was about a topic specifically that I was happy to see that you actually discussed in your book. I was surprised. And this is the real reason why we have arguments. What I've always boiled down to arguments is the macroscopic versus the microscopic. So let's talk about like something like the death penalty, for instance. The macroscopic would be dealing with the statistics behind it. How often do people die? How often are people wrongfully executed? How much is this going to cost? What is the effect going to be on the general public? Those are the macroscopic details of this conversation. The microscopic would be the nitty gritty moral claims about this, such as how much moral worth do we place on a human being, right? How much should we care about the fact that we're actually killing people? And this seems to be the foundation of why conservatives and liberals don't agree. And you bring up conservatives, how conservatives want a strict father government to impose discipline on the nation and provide security for its children. For instance, for abortion, for instance, they don't want government. Sorry, they're against no government intervention, and then they're for government intervention on military spending. So, would you mind elaborating on that? Because I think that's a brilliant idea.
Yeah, so of course, scientists studying political left-right differences and the psychology of it is now a new thing, and lots of people are doing it. So I also quote Jonathan Haidt in there, who's done this, and Alan Fiske has looked at this, the anthropologist, and then I especially liked George Lakoff's cognitive approach. So Lakoff studies metaphors in our cognition, like the universe is like a clockwork machine, or the mind is like a computer or a telephone system or a telegraph system, or different metaphors that scientists have used to try to understand the world. In a way, we all do this. The world is complicated, it's difficult to understand, so we use metaphors to help us grasp a big subject. In politics, the metaphor he uses that I think explains a lot is the family. The nation is like a family. Well, what kind of family? Well, as Lakoff describes it, as you just said, conservatives think of the nation as a strict father family, and that the president's job is like dad. I think it was Milo who called Trump daddy or something like that.
Yeah,
I
Milo
remember when
Yiannopoulos.
he did. Remember when he did that? I thought, oh boy, he must have been reading Lakoff. And that when conservatives say, well, I'm in favor of small government, they're not in favor of small government. They're in favor of a strong government in the father sense of protecting the family from threats, and so strong military, strong police, strong court systems, law and order. These cost money, right? And so conservatives are in favor of big government when it comes to those sorts of things. Now, of course, they say, oh, well, that's because it's justified. Yeah, fine, but don't make the case that you're in favor of small government. You're not, right? So, and then liberals, their metaphor is the nurturant family metaphor of the nation. That the job of the government is to, help those who can't help themselves, help people pull themselves up by their bootstraps. That is, children need guidance, but not punishment, not strict law and order sort of thing. So it comes down to the psychology of how you think what the role of the government is. And I think between Lakoff and Fisk and Jonathan Haidt and a few others that have studied this, Jonathan Jost is another one that looks at the psychology of conservatism or liberalism and what it is that people are after. So here's the problem to explain. Why is it that if I know your position on abortion, for example, I can tell what your position is on guns, immigration, business, financial reform, any number, one of a dozen different subjects that I don't even know you. I don't even know what you think about any of these things. But if I know your position on abortion, I can predict where you're going to fall in these. That's just crazy. How can that be? These are separate, independent issues that we should be evaluating independently of each other, but they're not. They're all tied to these larger categories. So I explore that in the book just to kind of, in this case, it was a chapter on guns. I was trying to understand what is it that conservative has about guns. I mean, they're just obsessed with guns. They're like fetishized. And then I realized reading Lakoff's like, oh, okay, the gun, it has nothing to do with guns. It has to do with a strict father whose job it is to protect the family. So a gun is like representing freedom, autonomy, protection, security, and force against evil, that sort of thing. Also, conservatives have a much more Manichaean black and white view of the world and far less nuanced than liberals about good and evil and things like that. So the gun is a very simple, straightforward representative of there are good people like me with the gun and bad people that have to be shot that have guns that want to do harm, right? That was what's his name, the NRA's famous line: the only way to stop a bad man with a gun is a good man with a gun. Yeah, except for all the other times when good people with guns shot themselves or their loved ones, whatever. Just ignore that pile of bodies over there. That's about 35,000 a year that die from guns. So anyway, but that's the idea, the psychology
Yeah.
behind it.
And it's fantastic. I think it's a very undervalued idea, especially when I'm listening to people whom I'm a big fan of, like Kyle Kalinske or David Pakman, and they're arguing against conservatives on gun control, as you were talking about. And in the back of my head, I'm just thinking to myself, you really need to start thinking about the moral implications that they're undergoing here, because that's really where the real meat of the argument is. And the second part of your book focuses on God and religion, which is, I think, the topic that sort of first threw me into the sphere of public discourse. And in fact, that's how I first found out about you, because I was sort of into the whole realm of atheism and I went through that. And it's not a conversation that is had that much anymore. Very few people are actually talking about religion at this point, or at the very least, religion in the same sense that we were talking about it back in 2006 and 2012. So do you think the reasoning behind this is that atheists sort of won the battle against creationism already?
Yeah, specifically, yes, that's the case ever since the Dover trial in 2005. That creationists, and that was a case of intelligent design creationism. They've lost all the court battles going back to the Louisiana creationism case in '87, the Arkansas trial in '67. So we've won that battle, and the rise of the nuns has shown that even if they're not atheists, the biggest religious cohort in America are the non-religious.
Hmm.
So I think since Trump was elected, people have started to focus on other things like politics rather than religion as a divisive force. And it's not that religion has gone away. The Christian right is still very active in these kind of grassroots programs of getting out the vote and voter suppression. So, when conservatives say, we're in favor of freedom and autonomy and letting people do their own thing, but then they want to get in your bedroom and tell you who you can have sex with, they're not in favor of freedom and autonomy. Or when they say, that we think everybody should have an ID to vote, that's a dog whistle, as they say. They're not really in favor of IDs, and they'll say that. But if you say, well, what about the gun show loophole? Like, people buy guns at these gun shows with fake IDs. That would be the equivalent of a voter fraud. And oh no, we can't enforce that because we're going down the slippery slope. Okay, and pretty soon it'll be the boot stomping Nazis walking down Main Street stealing our guns. Okay, so again, what's behind that question, right? So um, I forgot where we started that because I went down the side road myself.
Oh,
What were we talking about?
whether or not atheists sort of won the battle
Oh,
against
the atheists, yes.
creationism.
So, okay, right. So now really it's the left, this whole political identity politics, that's sort of the equivalent of religion. In a way, it's very much like religion. It has its own set of dogmas that you have to adhere to, that you're born in original sin, that you have to atone for. The original sin in identity politics is you are born a racist. You are born a bigot. You're born a misogynist. Whatever
Hmm.
your sin is, and it doesn't matter how much you apologize for these sins. We're still going to condemn you if you don't toe the line exactly the way we think you should. So in a way, this is what I'm pushing back against in giving the devil his due. I say give them their due too, but this idea of the censoriousness of the far left very much mirrors that of the far right in decades past, and weirdly it's conservatives that are now defending free speech. You'll hear people like Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity talking about free speech, the importance of free speech. Are you kidding me? These guys would have been on the front lines of censorship back in the 80s and 90s when everybody was up in arms about Madonna's videos and rock lyrics and these kinds of things. Those were conservatives who were against all that. Something screwy has happened in the last few decades where now, I'm considered something of a controversial figure for saying we should give people their free speech, like I'm a right-wing nut. It's like, no, I'm pretty much liberal the way you guys, you liberals are liberals in the sense of ticking the box. I'm pro-choice and separation of church and state. I want some gun control. We should have some immigration, of course, and on and on, pretty much right down the line. Most liberals will go, yeah, Shermer's a liberal. But if I say, well, we need to give people their right to speak, and whoa, no, wait a minute, it's like, hey, guys, you used to argue this, right?
Hmm.
So here's the argument I make in the book of why this whole hate speech thing. This is where the whole thing went screwy. The idea that language matters, it does. What you call people matters, it does. And you start with the low hanging fruit, just say like using the N word. We shouldn't do that. I agree, we shouldn't do that. And don't call women the C word, and don't call Jews kikes, and so forth. These are, really slanderous, hateful language. Don't do it. Okay, I'm on board with that. But legislating that is a different thing entirely, because once you establish the category, this is not just a forbidden word, but an illegal word. Then that category will grow with mission creep. Well, what else are we going to put in there that constitutes hate speech? Because hate speech is a form of violence. We have to fight against violence, fight violence with violence. And then all of a sudden you have like Antifa saying, let's get out there and mix it up and punch Nazis. And, to them, everybody's a Nazi that's not a member of Antifa. And that's what you get when you get this mission creep. It's like it's too much. And so I'm proposing we go back, way back to even pre 1919 was where I opened the book with Schenck versus the United States, where the Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes famously said, you can't shout fire in a crowded theater, falsely shout fire in a crowded theater, because it creates a clear and present danger that Congress should be authorized to prevent. Okay, what was this clear and present danger in 1919? It was a guy named Schenck, Charles Schenck, who was printing flyers that he handed out to draft age young men that told them the draft is unconstitutional. Now, this is as the United States was going into the First World War, so they were doing this several years before this. And, conscription was the law. So you have to join the military. And by doing so, the government is saying, we own your body for the period of time you're in the military, and we can send you off to die. And Schenck was saying, wait, the 14th Amendment says the government can't do that. That's a form of slavery. Okay, whatever your position is on conscription in the draft, I think most people are against it now. At the time, that was controversial. But at the very least, we should be able to debate that. You should be able to have a public forum and discuss it. But the United States Supreme Court said, no, you can't. You can't debate that. That is a clear and present danger to the security of the United States. Once you set that up, anything can be put in that basket. Anything you think is a clear and present danger, I think, you think, pretty soon everything is a clear and present danger, and everybody's censored or silenced, even if it's just self-censorship. Anyway, that's the problem as I see it.
That's good. And you mentioned an incredibly important point there that I think should be highlighted is the religious tendencies that the regressive left has when it comes to the concepts of redemption, when it comes to the concepts of original sin. I think that's incredibly important, especially since many of the people on the regressive left are, unfortunately, as you mentioned, secularists, where it's sort of the term secularism has been associated with the regressive left. And this is a sort of a good segue into the conversation about politics and society. And I know Bruce has a question that he's been dying to ask you in this regard.
Yes, Dr. Shermer, there seems to be the in the framework of a world crises, whenever something big hits the fan, the idea of liberalism is always comes into play to be questioned, like whether or not liberalism is a failed experiment. Now, just before World War II, there was someone by the name of Carl Schmitt. He's a political theorist and Nazi. He critiqued liberalism pretty much as a sideshow, in which the rational debates we have regarding a plethora of issues, it's only a smokescreen covering for circumstances in which there's a major emergency and there's a certain body or power having the final say to make a decision during this time. Now, I'm not going to completely agree with him because the separation of powers is prevented the absolute authorities from the quote unquote interesting person we have as our president at this time. But but there's an argument to be made that liberalism is really slow to respond because of these kinds of deliberations. And there's the question as to whether or not liberalism really still is the best answer in the 21st century. And that Yuval Noah Harari talks about this in some of his books, like especially since we have a wave of new technologies coming up, like AI and some other machinery we have that's able to pick up on human tells, emotions, and in China they even have the social scoring system now that allows a governing body to grade people based on behaviors. So it could be argued that with the regressive left and the populist right really at odds right now, like there's more of a success of China being able to export its governmental model out into the world a little bit more successfully. So we could see a authoritarian model similar to, say, Thomas Huxley's Brave New World coming into play. Now, do we see liberalism evolving as an appropriate countermeasure to this, or do we see the ability for some new kind of political system that incorporates aspects of liberalism to continue to promote the ideals of the Enlightenment?
Yeah, you've just tapped in one of the deepest questions of all that Karl Popper explored in his book on the open society. That is, there's something of a paradox to liberals being tolerant of everyone, because then the intolerant can gain a toehold and eventually power, and then the tolerant are considered intolerant, are considered to be part of the category that we're not going to tolerate, right. And therefore tolerance loses out. Well, that hasn't happened historically since Popper wrote that book. There are very few cases where that has happened, and they're almost always in these autocratic regimes that started off as democratic. There aren't very many. And so for the most part, I don't worry about that. I think we should just continue to push for these liberal reforms. Liberalism in the traditional sense that I'm calling classical liberalism, as most liberals would have seen themselves maybe 50 years ago or before that. Most of the progress in society we've experienced over the past 3 centuries have been due to liberal reforms, pushing against conservative trends of, maintaining these old social hierarchies and structures that conservatives want to conserve. So for the most part, I think liberalism is a good thing. What we're talking about with identity politics, let's just call that leftism. It's leftism that's a religion. It's leftism that's intolerant. It's not even tolerant of intolerance and it's been taken over. It's just intolerant, period. And they've gone down the rail. They've gone off the rails. They're really not part of liberalism anymore, in my opinion. Even though if you talk to somebody individually who calls themselves a social justice warrior or something like that, there's not that much daylight between me and them on specific issues like abortion, immigration, whatever. It's really kind of like how it's implemented and who they're willing to tolerate. Like to me, I have lots of conservative friends, and we disagree on a great many things, but there's kind of a mutual respect that we'll agree to disagree, and some issues are not solvable ultimately. There's complex moral issues that you have competing rights, like in the abortion issue, the rights of the fetus versus the rights of the mother. There's no ultimate solution to that, so therefore we just have to agree to disagree and continue living in peace, relative peace. But for social justice warriors or leftists, whatever term we want to use, they don't want to tolerate that, and that's a problem. Again, none of us are omniscient. We don't know for sure. You have to allow people to differ from you, or else there's nowhere to go from there. There's no path forward to a better society if you don't continue to push for the traditional liberal reforms. Anyway, that's my thoughts on that.
Dr. Shermer, are you concerned that humanism can be viewed as a religion? In some of my own circles, again, like I've heard it defined as such, but there doesn't really seem to be much of an effort to distinguish between what Yuval Harari calls, what's the word, intrasubjective reality, and that he defines it as something as like ideas or stories um, that are grounded in reality, with science being the ultimate factor in determining what causes flourishing or harm, as opposed to ideas that just float
Yeah.
off into space, with the idea of the end goal being getting into a heaven that has no evidence for existence.
Yeah.
Now we discussed critical thinking earlier. Now along these lines, especially among those who critique atheism as a nihilistic view of reality, um, other people out there who will give you a kind of gotcha, saying like, you're just trying to construct a religion, because it strikes me that um, there might not be a clear line of distinction between ideas in which people are trying to draw the line between good and bad being grounded in reality and good and bad being grounded in fantasy. And the
Yeah.
results two are very, very different.
Yeah, it's an interesting problem. It's a little bit like people say science is a religion or you treat it as a religion. No, 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 because there is no dogma in science other than we want to know reality. That's it, whatever it is. And there's no supernatural entities. There's no deities or anything like that. So if humanism is a religion, then everything's a religion. Nothing's a religion. The term should mean something. And maybe you call humanism a worldview, which is fine. That's what it is. It's a secular worldview, or it's a science-based worldview, or it's a worldview based in science and reason. However you want to modify it, with the idea that it's humans, or I guess now we would say sentient beings, because we want to include some animals that can suffer, and so starting with the cetaceans, whales, and dolphins, and porpoises, and sea lions, and so forth, and of course the great apes, and then move down from there. Okay, let's not worry about lobsters and cockroaches just yet. So by humanism we mean the survival and flourishing of sentient beings. Okay, and that respecting the rights and autonomous rights of all individual sentient beings. And it's just, that's it. It's just pretty much pretty broad from there. And I think humanists should be able to differ on specific points that are not clear what the correct answer is. Again, like the abortion issue, I would like to accept as humanists pro-lifers, because they're just making a different argument in terms of the rights of the fetus versus the rights of the mother. There has to be room for tolerating disagreement on some of these issues that don't have ultimate answers. Even though I'm quite confident in my pro-choice position, I recognize the other side. Okay, that would be a humanist, in my opinion. A humanist view is tolerating these other people that are different from me, and that is what I think has been driving the moral progress of the last several centuries, is not not driving a stake into a single position that you can't move away from, like traditional religions do, or traditional political parties or whatever, but having a much broader tent in that sense. So I think for all of us, I'd like everybody to be a humanist, including Christians and Jews and Muslims and conservatives and whatever. Everybody should embrace these ideas. Most of them do without saying it. Again, as I mentioned, like conservatives today completely accept interracial marriage as a totally natural, perfectly fine thing. But they didn't 50 years ago. So what happened? Well, they had their consciousness raised. So that's a kind of they're now kind of humanists in that regard. Anyway, so I just think it'd be better if we had a broader tent in that sense.
That's really
Yeah.
interesting that you say that because with I on occasion watch Dave Rubin's show, and he's what I think is very interesting is that he brings on right now what seems to be a plethora of conservative guests, and now we see the conservative movement seems to have liberalized enough to have accepted to be much more accepting of homosexuals. We see Peter Thiel supporting
Yeah,
President
yeah,
Trump. We see them even be accepting of Dave Rubin.
yeah.
Um, now, there, I'm, I'm something of a pessimist. I unfortunately believe that we're going to get Trump for another 4 years, and that there's a very real danger of there being a Supreme Court majority. But um, thinking along the expansion of the immoral arc, I hold a little bit of optimism that just maybe, we may have liberalized enough to the point where conservatives are not yesterday's conservatives, that they may have moral sensibilities that are more liberalized. So there's the possibility, however slight, that it I hate to use these words, that it may, maybe not be as bad as we make it out to be because of
Yeah.
this. Yeah,
Bruce, you should be an optimist. Come on, don't be a
Yeah.
pessimist. You're too
I,
young to be a pessimist. You have your whole life ahead of you. Come on, man. Yeah,
Yeah.
well, again, the labels matter because people use labels. Conservative. I'm a conservative, therefore I believe in this. So I'm a liberal. I believe that. It's hard to get past that. I don't know what the right, metaphor there is to get people to change their. So I like to talk about specific cases, specific issues, and reason about them, and then go from there. But in any case, gentlemen, I have another interview coming up here in a few minutes. So let's see if we can have any final wrap-up questions.
Oh, absolutely. So we actually have three audience questions. We had four, but you already
Oh,
answered
great.
one of them.
Okay. Yeah, go for it.
So very quick fire questions. Question number one, the humanities has sort of taken a detour from other academic departments. What is the future, as best we can tell, of the liberal arts tradition in the West?
Yeah, oh boy, that's a good one. Well, of course, coronavirus pandemic is going to, I think, could alter some of how education is done. We've seen you can do a lot remotely. The difference between me yammering at the chalkboard giving a lecture versus sitting right here recording a lecture and sending it to my students is negligible. Obviously, it's different for seminar discussions. That helps to be in the same room. Zoom is not as good for sure, but in terms of liberalizing the academy, it's gone too far to the left for sure. And I think, thinking optimistically, those of us pushing back against that, like Jonathan Haidt with his heterodox academy and so forth, there's a lot of academics in there. Turns out his membership roll grew so fast. It was stunning how many academics have kept their mouth shut and been afraid to say anything that just joined the group and go, yes, now we have a voice,
really.
and pushing back against that far leftism on the academy. So I think the problem is not as bad as we thought it was. Here you have the spiral of silence, the so-called pluralistic ignorance, where everybody thinks everybody else thinks a certain way until somebody speaks up, and then other people speak up, and then it's like, oh, okay, I'm not the only one, and it kind of emboldens people to speak out against something that's going too far.
Okay.
But optimistically, I think the academy will shift in maybe the next decade or so.
That's great. Question number two, why are so many atheists, socialists, and or communists? Do they replace God with a mystical belief in the collective? How can those supposedly committed to a scientific worldview fail to comprehend the principles of self-organization inherent in the operation of a free society and market?
Yeah, when I first became an atheist, I wondered the same thing. It's like these are all pretty far left people. Where are the conservative atheists and the libertarian atheists and whatever, Green Party atheists? Well, most of them are probably. And the answer seems to be that it's not really about the belief in God. It's about a commitment to a particular worldview that they just happen to be atheists. I think the atheism. I think we should quit thinking of it as a worldview. It's not a worldview. It's nothing. It's just I don't believe in God. Full stop. What do you believe in? Okay, well then that's what I would call humanism. So the things I'm talking about in giving the devil his due is about humanism, not atheism. Although I'm an atheist and I talk about what that means, which is nothing, and how why people should be atheists because the evidence is just not that good for accepting the existence of God. But from there's nowhere to go. That's just the end. It's like I don't believe in fairies either. But so what? That doesn't define who I am.
Mhm.
Anyway, so I think that's the solution to that. Be a humanist, not an atheist.
Yeah, 100% agree. And the last
Yes.
question, this is an interesting one. Do you find any credence in the idea that COVID-19 originated in a biolab in Wuhan?
Oh, yeah, I wrote about that. Well, so I wrote about it. I reported on what Nature published, Nature Medicine published an important article of a lab that looked at the DNA of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that gave rise to the COVID-19 pandemic, and that it doesn't have the I don't really know what this means, but the spinal characteristics of the virus's
Mm,
DNA structure is not such that it was bioengineered, but that it did come from a bat. And when you think about it, that makes a lot of sense for those of us that don't know that technology and that science. You know, bats are mammals. They live in these massive colonies of millions of individuals close by each other. It's very, the virus is respiratory virus and it attacks the lungs. There's that cave in Texas where there's like 20 million bats that live, side by side, like Mexico City. It's just it's the kind of environment for a virus to grow ripe. So much more likely to be the byproduct of these wet markets from bats rather than a bio weapon.
yeah, that's good. I've heard the same exact thing from the guy who was I forget his name, but he was on the Joe Rogan show, and he was saying the same exact thing. I wish I could understand it, but
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah.
a epidemiologist or anything like that. But Dr. Shermer, it's been an absolute honor to have you on the
Oh, you're
podcast.
welcome.
And I should also mention that I recently found this out. You're an advisor for the Atheists for Liberty group. I'm
Right, that's
having
right.
I'm having the founding presidents, Sheedy, up on the
Yeah, yeah,
podcast
good,
pretty soon. So
good.
that's
Well,
great.
say hi to Thomas for me.
Will do.
All
But
right, gentlemen.
thanks for listening to this episode. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at LateInPhysicist if you enjoyed what you watch. You can also follow me on Instagram at PlayEdson2019. I try to post as often as I can. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.